You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. Hello, and welcome to Ben Franklin's World Revisited, a series of classic episodes that bring fresh perspective to our latest episodes and add deeper connections to our understanding of early American history. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. This week is Thanksgiving week in the United States. On Thursday, most of us will sit down with friends, family, and other loved ones and share a large meal where we will give thanks for whatever we're grateful for over the last year. Now, in elementary school, we're taught to associate this holiday and its rituals with the religious separatists, or pilgrims, who migrated from England to what is today Plymouth, Massachusetts. We are taught that at the end of the fall harvest, the separatists sat down with their indigenous neighbors to share in the bounty that the Wampanoag people helped them grow by teaching the separatists how to sow and cultivate crops like corn in the coastal soils of New England. In our last revisited episode, episode 290, we learned about the Wampanoag and Narragansett peoples before the colonists' arrival in December 1620. In this revisited episode, episode 291, we will investigate the arrival of the Mayflower and the indigenous world that the separatists arrived in. We'll also explore how the Wampanoag and Narragansett peoples interacted with their new European neighbors and how they contended with the English people who were determined to settle on their lands. With that, let's re-enter the world of the Wampanoag, a people who still proudly live in present-day Massachusetts and Rhode Island. I also wish you and your family a very happy Thanksgiving. In late fall 1620, the Wampanoag village of Patuxet stood nearly empty. Developed over thousands of years, this established and thriving community was recently devastated by the epidemic of 1616 to 1619. The Wampanoag would recover, but it was a confusing and difficult time. And it was into this confusing and difficult time that the Pilgrims arrived. The ship Mayflower left England and set sail for North America on September 6, 1620. After an ocean crossing of 66 days, the ship sailed into what the English would later call Plymouth Harbor on December 16, 1620. The 236-ton Mayflower carried more than 100 passengers, who crammed inside its 106-foot-long, 25-foot-wide frame, the equivalent of just more than the length of 2 school buses placed end to end. For comparison, the 30 to 40-man ocean-going Wampanoag boats, or machoons, that we discussed last episode, were longer than 3 school buses placed end to end. The English passengers intended to become settlers by establishing a plantation or a permanent place of residence in North America. Using small wooden boats aboard the Mayflower, a contingent of passengers rowed their way to the shoreline, where they found a space that looked livable, even lived in, but also not quite populated. The colonists did not see any people, but the land they decided to establish their settlement on was located on high ground. Ground that had largely been cleared of trees, had black, fertile soils, with evidence that corn had been planted there 3 or 4 years before. And the ground had the advantage of being located both near the ocean and sources of fresh water. The ground the English chose for their settlement was the site of the Wampanoag village of Patuxet. Unbeknownst to the English, in the 3 years before their arrival, an epidemic had ravaged and devastated approximately 90% of the Wampanoag population, including a population who lived at Patuxet.
I was fortunate when they landed when they did for them, the colonists, because we just suffered from a major epidemic that wiped out up to 90% of our people in a 2 or 3 year span.
Darius Coombs is the director of Wampanoag and Algonquin interpretive training at Plymouth Patuxet Museums. This living history museum was founded in the 1940s, and through thorough research, interprets the Wampanoag people and the colonial English community that settled amongst them in the 1600s. Darius is also Mashpee Wampanoag, a citizen of the Wampanoag Nation.
Our skin turned yellow, people got open sores in their bodies, and they died within 2 or 3 days. Common thought over the years, hepatitis. People say smallpox, but we kind of ruled out smallpox. Disease control came out with something over 10 years ago. They believe it was from the French trade ships up in Maine. And when those trade ships came over, they would have rats on the ships, and the rats would get off, and the fetus of the rats will get into the water system, creating infectious liver disease that swept along the coastline. This epidemic that came here was 3 years before the pilgrims got here, right? It was between probably 1616 and 1619. It went 30, 40 miles inland along the coast of Maine, wiped out whole nations of people. And like I said, for Wampanoag people, it affected us up to 90% wiped out.
Years before the Pilgrims arrived in North America, Europeans had traded more than just trade goods with the native peoples they traded with along North America's northeastern Atlantic coastline. They had also brought diseases. As Darius Coombs related, these diseases devastated and sometimes killed entire villages and nations of native peoples. So when the English colonists arrived at Patuxet, what would later be called Plymouth, Massachusetts, in December 1620, the landscape and demography of the Dawnlands, what we've come to call New England, had changed.
When they got here, it was a changed place. When they got here, it was a year, 2 years after that epidemic hit us, you know. If they landed 4 or 5 years before, it might have been a different story. This whole area was populated with people. And when they landed in Patuxet, this whole area was devastated. The nearest living communities was probably Manamet, what's called Manamet, about 10 miles south. We're caring people, we're loving people. But it's also a good time which people needed each other, you know. They needed an ally because of the native communities that didn't care for them being here. And also we needed an ally a lot of the time because we just got devastated. We needed help in a way. They needed each other. It was a very, very confusing time too. The leaders we lost, the chiefs, the medicine people, the political leaders.
When the English colonists arrived at Patuxet 400 years ago, they arrived at a confusing time. The world of the Wampanoag people had changed in the wake of a destabilizing epidemic. Still, the Wampanoag who remained persisted. They continued to practice and observe their deeply established economy, culture, and politics, even as the English colonists settled on their village sites and colonized the Dawnlands. This episode is part of a 2-episode series about the world of the Wampanoag. In episode 290, we investigated the life, cultures, and trade of the Wampanoag and their neighbors, the Narragansett, up to December 16, 1620, the day the Mayflower made its way into Plymouth Harbor. In this episode, episode 291, our focus will be on the world of the Wampanoag in 1620 and beyond. We'll explore the changes and continuities in Wampanoag life as they work to recover from the devastating epidemic of 1616 to 1619. We'll also investigate how the Wampanoag contended with life that after 1620 involved sustained contact, not just with European traders, but with English people determined to settle on their land. So who were these English arrivals, and how did they come to find themselves in Wampanoag country?
Well, the English colonists who came to Plymouth had a variety of reasons for coming. My name is Carla Pestana, and I am a historian of early America and the Atlantic world. I teach at UCLA, where I'm also the department chair at the moment, and I hold the Joyce Appleby Endowed Chair of America in the World, which I've had for the last 8 years.
In addition to teaching at the University of California, Los Angeles, Carla Pestana has published a book, The World of Plymouth Plantation, which seeks to reconnect our centuries-old perceptions of Plymouth with the reality of the lives of its inhabitants. In essence, Carla separates the facts of the past from the myths of historical memory to help us recover the real lives and goings-on of the Plymouth Plantation colony.
About half of them had been members of a church in Leiden in the Netherlands, and many members of that church, though not all of them, had the idea to leave the Dutch-controlled area of Europe and move to an English-controlled area of the Americas. The members of that church did not want to live in England because their particular brand of Reformed Protestantism was not welcomed in England.
To practice their version of Protestant Christianity, the members of the English Church in the Netherlands left England and decided to establish a home in the Dawnlands, which they thought of as the English-claimed area of North America. With this decision in place, they had to find financial backers. Migrating to North America and establishing a colony was difficult work. It required a lot of money, time, and labor. It also required more than a group of co-religionists. To establish a thriving colony, the Leiden Church members also needed to find other English people who had skills in carpentry, building, and husbandry. So to make their dream of settlement in North America a reality, the Leiden Church members had to engage in a fair bit of recruiting.
They got backers in England, investors who were willing to support a settlement in the Americas because they saw it as a potential way to make money. In 1620, the English colonies were starting to seem like a place that people could go, which hadn't been true much before that. Virginia was doing better than it had in its first decade, and Bermuda, the Somers Island, was recently settled, and English people were starting to think of the Americas as a destination to which they could go. So this was part of a larger movement that would pick up in the 1620s of people moving into various locations in the Americas.
As Carla Pestana mentioned, the Leiden Church members' migration to North America was actually part of a larger transatlantic movement of people. One of the largest transatlantic movements was the forced migration of enslaved people who were taken from Africa to the Americas. But there were also Europeans now moving to the Americas to claim territory. Some came by the direction of their monarch, like Spanish explorers and settlers. Others came in smaller groups. While the English settlers set out to claim lands and to settle in the Caribbean or in Virginia, the members of John Robinson's Leiden Church landed in Wampanoag country. Why did they make that choice? Was that where they intended to land?
Well, they had a deal with the Virginia Company that they would have a semi-autonomous settlement in the northern reaches of Virginia, which would have been around Delaware, maybe, that part of the coast. Remember, the king had basically divided the eastern seaboard of North America north of Spanish Florida up to Maine into two halves and given it to these two companies, the Virginia Company of London, the one that we now know about because it actually succeeded in establishing a colony, as opposed to the Virginia Company of Plymouth. So they were going to be under the authority, the jurisdiction of the colony of Virginia, but they were going to have a certain amount of local autonomy within that. So it was perfect from the Leiden Church's point of view. They sailed much later than they meant to. They sailed, late in the season. And when they arrived, they ended up further north than they intended, came into Cape Cod Bay, and it was already December. And they had to decide, do we stop here or do we, sail out and around Cape Cod and down and try to find where it is we had originally intended to go?
Yeah, they landed here. They landed in Wampanoag country. That's when they landed in Patuxent. And when they landed here, they found devastation. This whole area was cleared up from that plague that came through, that epidemic. And that's when they started building in December 1620. It's unfortunate that first winter, there was a lot more deaths. February, from what I hear, in 1621 was the deadliest months for them, There's numerous sightings of Wampanoag people during that first winter. They say they saw two native people on a hill and they waved them over, but the men didn't come over. But they heard a lot of native people yelling in the background, so it was more than just two people. They saw another Wampanoag party of numerous men walking through the woods with the dogs. There was another time in which they saw native people on Clark's Island, which is an island off of Plymouth. It's about 3 miles out. But they never encountered anybody physically and talked to them, not until March of 1621.
So the Leiden Church members had intended to settle in the northern part of Virginia, which in 1620 would have been somewhere along the coastline of present-day Delaware. Instead, a late start and a bit of faulty navigation caused the English colonists to sail first into Cape Cod Bay, and then into a more sheltered bay off mainland Massachusetts, a bay that's now called Plymouth Bay. So the English colonists did not initially choose to settle at Patuxent. They made that choice only after arriving in North America, and finding that winter seas and sick passengers prevented the Mayflower from sailing around Cape Cod and heading farther south. Now, as Darius Coombs mentioned, the colonists found the Wampanoag village of Patuxent to be an ideal building site. Of course, so did the Wampanoag, which is why they had developed it over centuries. Patuxent occupied high ground, and by 1620, there was evidence of fertile soils that had been used to plant corn, and much of its space had already been cleared of trees. Further, those Patuxets who had survived the epidemic would have already moved inland to spend the winter months in their fall and winter villages. Still, As Darius noted, there were many Wampanoag people around to notice the colonists' arrival. They would have noticed the colonists' efforts to build new homes, a place of worship, and a protective palisade at Patuxet. They may have also noticed how the colonists struggled with their first on-lands winter, and with the heavy death toll that came from that experience. By March 1621, 45 of the 102 Mayflower passengers had died.
They're not expecting it to be as harsh a winter as they find. And also, they're, 100 people, many of them ill, crammed into, and they were crammed into a fairly small sailing vessel. So the ship itself is not a very comfortable place to be, but the weather that they're seeing is not that welcoming either. In spite of the emphasis on a rock that serves as sort of a dock, allowing them to step off their boats onto a dry spot and walk onto land, they actually, and they describe in some of the early texts, they actually wade through the water as one would expect, taking smaller boats off the ship, getting as close as they can, and then stepping off these boats and walking through the waves. So when they get onto land, it's not the greatest weather to begin with. Plus, they're wet up to their knees, so, and, if we picture the material reality of their lives, it's not like they have lots of clothes to change into, or that it's easy to dry out all those layers of clothes or any of those kinds of things. So they're probably pretty miserable in that time. The building of structures, they're having to fell trees, they're having to build, and that's not easy to do at any time, but certainly not as it's snowing and it's damp and it's cold. So, it's not an easy time for them. It's a terrible time to arrive, and they actually had intended to arrive much earlier.
The English, of course, had arrived at the worst time that you could in any New England winter, much less a very cold, little ice age New England winter, had suffered devastating losses from starvation and exposure over the winter, and their numbers had been halved.
Andrew Lippman is an associate professor of history at Barnard College. He's the author of the Bancroft Award-winning book, Saltwater Frontier, Indians in the Contest for the American Coast. He's also the author of the forthcoming book, The Death and Life of Squanto. Now, as Andrew and Carla described, the English colonists had arrived in the Dawnlands at the worst possible time of year to try and build a settlement. But build they did. And as they built their new houses, a blockhouse chapel, and a palisade, they were watching the Wampanoag, who were also watching them. It wasn't until March 1621 that the Wampanoag made their first direct encounter with their new neighbors.
What's very important to remember is what happened 6 years prior. There was an English explorer, John Smith, and he came around Virginia, mapped out Virginia, came around New England and mapped out New England. And before he left in 1614, this is 6 years before the Pilgrims arrived, he left his captain behind being Thomas Hunt. What Thomas Hunt did, he landed in Patuxet, what is Plymouth today, and took 19 Patuxet as slaves, went down on Cape Cod and took 8 Nauset Wampanoag as slaves.
Interacting with Europeans wasn't anything new. The Wampanoag had been trading and interacting with Europeans for almost 100 years before the arrival of the Mayflower. Since the 1520s, European explorers and fishermen had traded for furs and peltry they no longer had in Europe, and for foodstuffs that they needed to support their seasonal fishing villages or their return voyages across the Atlantic. As Darius mentioned, in some instances, as in the instance of Thomas Hunt in 1614, these European explorers and fishermen also captured and enslaved native peoples. It is likely because of these earlier encounters with Europeans that the Wampanoag kept their distance and observed the colonists from afar throughout the winter of 1620-1621. However, it is also because of these earlier experiences of violence with Europeans that when they were ready, the Wampanoag found themselves able to communicate with the settlers.
Pretty early on, though, even before Squanto is taken captive, there are enough repeat visitors, and from 1605 onwards, other native men from the Dawnland regions, from both near Patuxet and further away, who've been taken as captives, who then start to act as translators and go-betweens. And it was at the beginning of the spring planting season that a nearby native man, this man Samoset, who came from further north in the Dawnland coast, arrived sort of as an initial emissary on behalf of various native people from the region.
Samoset wasn't even from around here. He was from up in Mohegan Island up in Maine. He was brought back down here as a guide in 1619 by Thomas Dermer. He ended up escaping. He went to go live in Massasoit's community of Pokanoket, about 40 miles west of Plymouth. And Massasoit sent Samoset into the Pilgrim village. He probably sent it because, one, he was one of his own men. Two, he could speak English. And he was considered to be a Sagamore. Sagamore, what that means is language is chief. So he's a good man to send in there. And Massasoit didn't know what was going to happen.
Usamequin, or the Massasoit, was the principal leader of the Wampanoag people. As the principal leader, Usamequin was responsible for the safety of the Wampanoag. So in early 1621, Usamequin carefully orchestrated Wampanoag interactions with the English colonists to make sure that there was not a repeat of 1614. At first, it seems Usamequin had Wampanoag men observe the colonists from afar to ascertain their activity and intentions. When the houses the colonists erected indicated that this group of English intended to stay in Wampanoag country, in March 1621, Usamequin sent Samoset, a native man from further north in the Dawnlands, to make physical contact with these Europeans. Having lived along the Maine coast, Samoset had repeated interactions with English fishermen who came near his home to fish and trade. These interactions allowed Samoset to pick up a working English vocabulary. Samoset knew enough English to greet the colonists at Patuxet and to convey that he came in peace, and that another man, a Wampanoag man named Tisquanto, who was more fluent in English, would visit them soon. As Darius Coombs suggested, it seems that Usamequin had sent Samoset, a non-Wampanoag man, to greet the colonists as another way to gauge whether the English at Patuxet had peaceful intentions. When Samoset returned to Usamequin unharmed, that's when he decided to send one of his own tribal members, Tisquanto, to meet the colonists.
Best known to most people as Squanto, Tisquanto was a Wampanoag man who was taken captive by English sailors in 1614, returned to his home in what is now the town of Plymouth, which he knew as Patuxet, in the year 1619, and soon thereafter was introduced by another native man to the Plymouth colonists, and he became their chief guide and translator from March of 1620 until his death in November or December of 1622. Well, so this is where Tisquanto's story is a bit different from the majority of native men taken captive. Most of the native men taken captive by English people, and as well by French as well, were brought immediately back to either England or France. Tisquanto is a little different in that his captor, Thomas Hunt, he was planning to sell them, native people, not to use them as translators or guides, but to sell them as slaves into a Spanish market for enslaved Indigenous people, which had already been in existence for about a century. The sale of enslaved native people was close to completely illegal, but not entirely. And at some point in this sale, Spanish officials figured out that these Indigenous men were not from the small parts of Spanish dominions where it was legal for Spanish people to take Indigenous people as slaves, that they were in fact from North America and thus could not be enslaved under Spanish law. At some point, Tisquanto manages to be brought to London. We know where he lived, in the house of John Slaney on Cornhill. John Slaney was a well-off merchant who had connections to a circle of merchants who were interested in expanding English influence everywhere in Europe and in the larger Atlantic. We also know, however, that his time overlapped with the Powhatan woman that we know best as Pocahontas, then known as Rebecca Rolfe, who was living only a few blocks away from him in London at this time. It's entirely possible, I'd say even probable, that at some point in their time there, Pocahontas and Tisquanto probably, if not met, in that they, shook hands, but were aware of each other's existence and probably laid eyes on each other. I think that seems a pretty safe guess. It wouldn't have been particularly easy for them to communicate. The Powhatan language is on this vast dialect continuum and would be not at all really intelligible to the Wampanoag language. So if they did meet and spoke, they probably spoke in English.
Tisquanto spent 5 years from the time of his capture in 1614 to his return to Wampanoag country in 1619, learning and speaking the English language. By the time Tisquanto returned to Patuxet in 1619, he was fluent in the English language as well as in his first language, Wampanoag. Tisquanto's return from England had been difficult. He was able to find passage from England to Newfoundland, where he joined Englishman Thomas Dermer's southbound crew as a guide. In exchange for his knowledge about the Atlantic coast and the native peoples who lived along it, Dermer returned to Squanto to Patuxet.
He makes his way down the coast with Dermer, and as soon as he starts moving south from Newfoundland, makes a horrible discovery that much of the Dawnland region has been hit by waves of epidemic disease and has been left severely depopulated. We can, I think, assume that Squanto is deeply upset, that he realizes there's a need for him to make some contact, both probably seeking out his own family and relations and a kind of larger network of people that he can reconnect with. But the details in terms of what exactly that network looked like, who, if anyone, directly related to him was surviving. So we know that this is obviously a hugely important moment for Tisquanto. I'm not entirely sure if this is how it went down in my own read of this, but it seems likely that Dermer delivered up Tisquantum to the Massasoit as a kind of prisoner and captive at that moment, so that he was not quite treated as a homecoming son returning, but as someone who, having been gone so long, probably at this point dressed in European clothing and speaking the foreigner's language, needed to be in some ways debriefed. We know from a later account that Tisquanto, at some point in this time period, did have an audience with the Massasoit and explained to him a bit about his assessment of the English, explained to him the time and the things he had seen in England. This appears in later sources that some sort of meeting and discussion happened. But it's the theory of the historian Neil Salisbury, and I think I agree with him, that pretty much until Tisquanto reappears in the European records, he was probably being enslaved would be too strong a word, but kind of the ward or under the kind of care and recognizance of Massasoit.
Sending Tisquanto to speak with the English at Patuxet allowed Usamiquin to gain more information from the colonists. Through Tisquanto, Usamiquin ascertained that the colonists had indeed come to settle permanently in Wampanoag country.
There's so much mythology around this moment as being kind of generally that the Pilgrims are being welcomed by people who wanted them there. That's clearly not the case in any way. This was a strategic decision of a canny political leader in a pretty desperate time to at least establish contact and before deciding whether or not to permit them to keep their village there. And that sort of careful kind of feeling out, getting more information, recognizant style is, I think, pretty characteristic of what I've been able to interpret of Massasoit as a leader, that he was someone who was very good at assessing and processing information and tended to favor consensus building as a general governing strategy.
With Tisquantum, they're able to have a deeper conversation, and they're able to use the fact of the translation skills that Squanto brings to have conversations with the local native peoples. They negotiate an agreement with a man they call Massasoit that allows them to be in the area and that says that they will be basically allies and trading partners. From there, they begin to encounter other groups and to understand that there's a complicated politics of native interactions, that there are these distinct groups not too far distant, that they have their own leaders, that those leaders might have some political relationship to Massasoit or might not. The Narragansetts in particular are referred to as enemies and fearsome people. And they were able to keep relations fairly calm by and large, but there are moments of severe tension and there are moments of violence as well.
What was interesting was a decision being made by Massasoit and the other Wampanoag people at the community at Pokanoket, which is where Massasoit was from, just to decide somewhat strategically to build up a web of alliance to work to create kind of allies in the side, primarily native, but to include this new English settlement, probably as kind of a defensive hedge against other native groups in the region that were seen as threatening Massasoit's community, in this case, probably the Narragansetts. That's sort of a general interpretation of the Wampanoags making a political calculation that this community was not necessarily as dangerous as they appeared, that they could be reasoned with, that they could be a source of various trade goods, and that temporarily permitting them to exist in peace would be a wise strategic move.
After doing his reconnaissance on the colonists, Usamequin approached the English in spring 1621 to propose a treaty. The main points of the treaty stated that the Wampanoag promised to defend the colonists against native attack, and the colonists promised to do the same for the Wampanoag should they be attacked. The Treaty of 1621 protected the colonists from the Wampanoag's native neighbors. It also protected them from other Wampanoag peoples, like those at Pecasset. The Pecasset Wampanoag sachem, Corpotant, objected to the English settlement at Patuxet, but as he was just a sachem and not the Massasoit, or the principal leader of the Wampanoag people, Corpotant and the Pecasset Wampanoag were powerless to overrule Usamequin in his dealings with the English. Negotiating a treaty like the Treaty of 1621 proved to be a difficult process. In addition to navigating different languages, the Wampanoag and English also had to navigate different cultural understandings about land, law, and governance. Where Usamequin believed that the Wampanoag had entered a treaty of peace, cooperative alliance, and mutual defense, the treaty the English colonists recorded reflected their view that English law would have the final say. This view of English legal superiority, combined with their idea of land as property that could be owned by individuals, served as core issues that opened the door to future conflicts about the rule of law and governance in Wampanoag country. Conflicts that would lead to warfare in the late 1630s and again in the 1670s. But in those first years, the Treaty of 1621 served to more closely unite the Wampanoag and English colonists by establishing a trade relationship. How do we know what the Wampanoag and the English traded?
There's a really exciting archaeological project that's happening in downtown Plymouth, Project 400, that's through the UMass Boston's Fisk Center for Archaeological Research.
That's Dr. Jade Lewis, the curator of collections at the Plymouth Patuxet Museums. Jade is a historical archaeologist and was a curator behind Plymouth Patuxet Museum's new archaeology exhibit, History in a New Light, illuminating archaeology of historic Patuxet and Plymouth.
They've been excavating a really intact section of the 1620s, 1630s Plymouth colony site. And what they found is that there's a contemporary Wampanoag site that's virtually a pace or two from the palisade wall, the fence surrounding the community. And it really puts in place how close these two communities were. There's a lot of textual evidence about pretty constant interactions between the English and the Wampanoag, but to physically see in space that they were neighbors really emphasizes this sort of high-stakes international diplomacy relationship that is hinted at in the writing.
With the Treaty of 1621 in place, and with the colder weather of winter giving way to the warmer weather of spring, Wampanoag people returned from their fall and winter villages to Patuxet for the planting season. As Jade Lewis revealed, archaeologists have found evidence that just a pace or two outside of the English palisade, that wall that surrounded their new village, the Wampanoag established another home site. This means that early on, the Wampanoag and English lived in very close proximity to one another. This makes sense. The Wampanoag were actually already at home at the place where the English were trying to establish their plantation. The English became just a new dynamic, incorporated into the world of the Wampanoag. Living within such close proximity to each other meant that both the Wampanoag and the English began to exchange goods, food, and cultural knowledge.
I think they spent a lot of time thinking about keeping the material reality of life, under control. They spent a lot of time thinking about food, growing it, gathering it, preserving it, preparing it. So I think just those aspects of life would have been hugely time-consuming for both men and for women, to the extent that the men did the heavy agricultural labor and any kind of hunting. At first, they have goats and chickens for sure. They bring pigs pretty quickly. Cattle, etc., are a little later in the 1620s. So they're gradually building up a kind of English farm economy, the basis for that with the livestock. But in the meantime, if they're going to eat meat or fish, they're just going to have to capture it themselves. And they're not hunters. I mean, they are not of a social status in England that they would have ever been involved in hunting. The English seeds that they bring don't do well. They plant things that the natives also plant. And there's actually a famous account of Squanto teaching them how to plant corn and beans and squash together.
What's also interesting about Tisquanto teaching them how to, grow this first harvest and how to survive in this land is that the work of raising crops was not traditionally the work of men in Wampanoag society. Men and children participated in the act of planting, so most any community member would know the basics of how to plant corn, but that this farming information of where to do it, how to do it, was mostly knowledge that Wampanoag women had, which I think brings out something interesting we can see in these early records. Edward Winslow in particular describes this first summer as being constantly, really in his word, being bothered or visited by Indigenous people, which I think if we kind of step away from the Eurocentric perspective here, what he's actually referring to is Indigenous people treating Patuxet as though it were Patuxet, a working Indigenous community where some are camping at the spot for fishing. It's a very rich harbor for fish and shellfish and for fowling, would have been part of a regular kind of seasonal practice of land use that Indigenous people had done for millennia in this region. And that in some ways, what's happening that first summer when Tisquanto is there acting as their guide and teaching them all these ways to use the landscape, they're also witnessing, with Tisquanto explaining to them in English what's happening, Indigenous people using this land and living off it as they always had. And that for a while, when there are all these, quote, visitors around this region, these are people who probably in some cases have connections to Patuxet. They could be families that have survivors from Patuxet. And we also know from these records, too, that there's references in Bradford to, quote, a member of Squanto's family in Bradford's account. So this implies to me, if we think of house, family, what they're talking about here is that Tisquanto does have a kinship network of people that are probably coming and staying with him, including women. These women are the people with this store of agriculture and planting and harvesting knowledge that Tisquanto himself probably doesn't have in the same stores, and that this acts of translation that are going on are really, Tisquanto, we could imagine in some ways, speaking to and talking about planting with Indigenous women he knows, and then translating this information to the English.
For millennia, Patuxet had served as a summer fishing and agricultural village for the Wampanoag. Just because the English had arrived in late 1620 and built a new English village on the site did not make Patuxet any less native. Instead, Patuxet grew and expanded to accommodate new instances of native English diplomacy and trade. Trade took multiple forms at Patuxet. One form was the exchange of agricultural knowledge. A piece of critical agricultural knowledge that the Wampanoag shared with the English was how to grow food in Wampanoag country. As Carla Pestana mentioned, the colonists were grateful for this knowledge, even if they pretty quickly abandoned the Wampanoag method of planting corn, beans, and squash together in favor of planting one crop per English planting row. The English still thought they should do things their own way. Another form that trade took at Patuxet was a trade in physical objects.
As far as the objects that are found in Patuxet, lots of points, lots of ceramic fragments have been found as well. You also see evidence of elements of dress, so gorgets, which would have been worn at the neck. You have evidence of food, so types of animal bones, shells, that sort of thing. There's a vast number of objects that are recovered representing life at this time for both the Wampanoag and for the English. You can see items that are Wampanoag, such as pottery, appearing in English houses. And that's showing that, it's not just items going back to the Wampanoag that are being traded, but Wampanoag are also trading items in as well. In the Wampanoag sites, you find European ceramics, you find glass beads that were often used as trade goods, lots of different pieces of metal kettles like brass and copper kettles that have been cut to pieces to be repurposed as points or beads. So for the Wampanoag, they're looking to acquire items that they want as far as, unusual goods that they can't get or easily get here in the Northeast. And for the English, it's primarily trading for goods that they can sell back in England, but also for items that they might just need here in the Northeast, like corn, like ceramics, other types of meats that makes it a little bit easier for them to survive as they're trying to figure out this new environment.
They are heavily reliant on items that come to them from England for clothing, for shoes, etc. They do sometimes get cloth, and then they're able to make the cloth into clothes, and the women would have been involved in doing that. But they suffer a fair amount from the fact that they cannot produce these things locally, and they don't have the ability to do it without things arriving from England.
The trade in goods was strategic for both the Wampanoag and the English. From the English, the Wampanoag acquired items that would help them fashion metal arrowheads for hunting and warfare, and items such as beads, copper, and brass to exchange with other native peoples, as these items were difficult to access in the Northeast. From the Wampanoag, the English acquired necessary items that helped them to live, or at least make do, until the next trade ship sailed in from Europe. They traded for ceramic pots, furs, and foodstuffs to help their families. Despite what seemed to be a good trade, the English colonists worried about living so near the Wampanoag. They worried about being able to keep peaceful relations with the Wampanoag, and they worried about their ability to maintain their Englishness. The English had strong prejudices about native peoples, and a strong sense of superiority of English ways.
There was a lot of anxiety with early colonists about the loss of their English identity or the over-influence of other cultures. And so you see that anxiety played out in sometimes really strange adherences to, English norms of dress and food production that maybe don't make sense logically, but philosophically make a lot of sense. For the English, you have evidence of elements of dress that when you think about coming to the Northeast in the 1620s and the fact that you have large forests and areas that haven't been cleared, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to wear a lot of heavy armor as you're moving through this space, or wear a lot of clothing that is loose and flowing and, many layers, especially if you've ever been here in summer. It can get very humid. But you see through the archaeology that people are still dressing in very English ways. And that may not always make logical sense as they're trying to, move into this area and make it more English.
The Wampanoag may have also worried about their relations with the English. Forging diplomatic ties fit within Usamequin's desire to forge a network of alliances, primarily native alliances, that would help protect the Wampanoag people from native attack, from further conflict with European explorers, fishermen, and enslavers, and to provide the Wampanoag with access to English technologies. However, unlike the English, the Wampanoag did not see peaceful relations with the colonists as key to their survival. In the big picture of the Dawnlands, the Plymouth colonists constituted a very small population, about 50 settlers in its first year, while within the wider world of the Dawnlands, there were thousands of native peoples, some of whom the Wampanoag had peaceful relations with, and some of whom they did not have good relations with. For the Wampanoag, relations with the English only made sense within the larger picture of Wampanoag diplomacy.
I think it's always a mistake if we think about this from the perspective of native peoples of being about the future survival of a European colony that simply was never central in their goals. They're always interested about their relationships with other native people. The English were always just a small part of a bigger plan in which native needs, native politics, native concerns, trying to rebuild societies after this massive, disturbing epidemic is the top priority of native leaders here. And that's the world in which native people are operating. And these 50-odd settlers, some of whom are young children, aren't considered super strategically important other than what technology they can offer, what protection they can offer from further visits of colonists or enslavers or what have you. And so that's always the way to think of it, that this is about native politicians, again, trying to bring about political stability after pretty horrible several years, and that the English people are a small part of that. In general, compared to many other early colonies, like, for example, the Jamestown colony, I think it's fair to say that relations were comparatively peaceful in early times, but that took a lot of work. It took a lot of work at first using Tisquanto as a guide and translator, with Massasoit regularly making diplomatic overtures and visits to many other native villages, and then encouraging various other native sachems to also visit Plymouth as well. So I think we can look at that first year of interaction between Wampanoag people and the Plymouth colonists as being a wary, uncertain time in which Massasoit and his community and his backers were looking to establish peaceful relations as part of building a more powerful alliance, mostly among native people. Tisquanto's actions to help the English colonists seemed very much part of his goal to be kind of just a general guide and emissary. The idea that if the English were safe and strong, that would help other Wampanoag people and their allies be safe and strong.
It's clear that after the English arrived in December 1620, that the world of the Wampanoag continued to operate largely as it had for millennia. The Wampanoag continued to organize their society around seasonal sustainable food supply. In spring and summer, the Wampanoag were living and working in villages near the coastal waters where they fished and the soils where they planted. In the fall and winter, they removed to large winter encampments where they had stored the food that they had grown and harvested or hunted and fished in earlier months, and where the trees and distance from the water provided protection from icy sea winds and winter storms. The epidemic of 1616 to 1619 definitely influenced how the Wampanoag approached diplomacy and the English colonists. As Darius Coombs noted at the start, forging alliances with as many people as possible seemed crucial to keeping the Wampanoag safe as they slowly recovered from the devastating loss of life inflicted by the epidemic. Still, often when we look at many histories of the Pilgrims' arrival at Plymouth in December 1620, we read that it was the English who brought great change to the world of the Wampanoag, not an epidemic of disease. Also missing from these books that recount the past is information about the Wampanoag's larger world and their longer history. If the world of the Wampanoag still operated as the world of the Wampanoag after the English arrived in December 1620, why do we remember the Pilgrims' arrival as a world-altering event? An event that in many American histories is described as the advent of religious freedom and even democracy, and the demise of the Wampanoag and the Indians of New England.
You may have noticed I have never used the word pilgrim. Pilgrim is a term that is assigned to them much later and is part of the myth-making that occurs around them, to make them as a founding group in U.S. history. The term pilgrim actually has a number of different implications, but when it's used in that mythic sense, it almost seems to imply that they've come on a mission to create America. They've come on a mission for religious liberty. They've come on a mission to create a settlement that will go on to become the United States. That's kind of how they're depicted in the early literature that extols them in the 18th and the early 19th century. And that image of them as purposeful in that respect is silly. I mean, there's no way they could have been thinking in those terms. So in that sense, the term pilgrim doesn't really make a lot of sense.
But this picture, which is focused on the people who came to be called the Pilgrims, is now finally beginning to change.
I was struck when all these commemorations were planned for the 400th anniversary that it's really the Native legacy that's become our focus. That is, for more than a century, 2 centuries, the focus was really on the settlers' experience itself. That they suffered for their beliefs, that they were hardworking, pious people who were willing to sacrifice in order to come to this place and set up a new society. And that had been the narrative for a very long time.
I think that in terms of what we see regarding Indigenous culture is that it's not a monolithic thing. Like, it wasn't that things had been the same before the arrival of Mayflower and then all of a sudden everything changed seriously. All through Indigenous history, you see changes that are being influenced by climate, by access to resources, by political shifts, by social relationships.
Think of 2 different numbers. Think of 400 years and think about 12,000 years. And we've been here on our homeland for over 12,000 years. There's 2 different words being tossed around a lot of the time: celebration and commemoration. And people are kind of not sure which one to pick, And I don't mind people saying celebration because it is a celebration for a lot of people, what's happened over those 400 years and how people have gained, So I don't mind people saying that at all. For us, it's not a big deal. It's because we've been here for a long time. What made these people different is they stayed and they formed a colony in 1620 that lasted. It's unfortunate because we had people coming over before, we have people come over afterwards. Before and after 1620, these are different people with different ways of thought a lot of the time. And that was just one boat that came over. But that one boat did establish a colony. One thing I always want people to remember is that we are a proudful people. We're still here today, come 2020, and we're not going anywhere. We'll be doing our education and raising our kids into the culture. Our culture, everybody should be proud of who they are.
So what can we remember in this anniversary year? A year that marks the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the Mayflower? We can remember that in 1620, the Mayflower was but a small part of a much larger world, the world of the Wampanoag. This episode is part of a 2-episode series about the world of the Wampanoag, which is co-written and co-produced by Liz Covart and Karen Wolf, and made possible with support from Mass Humanities. If you're looking for more information about this series, our guest experts and scholars, and notes and links for all the information we discussed today, visit the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/291. The show notes page is also where you'll find a list of resources and texts that we use to write this series, plus pictures from some of the objects we talked about today. Again, you can access this list of resources and pictures at benfranklinsworld.com/291. We're grateful to the large number of historians, tribal experts and spokespeople, and museum professionals who took the time to speak with us during the course of our research. We're also grateful for the research assistance of Gail Coughlin and Eugene Tesdall. The original music you heard throughout this episode was composed by Joel Roston in collaboration with Wampanoag musician Durward Vanderhoop. The Wampanoag songs included in the score and arranged throughout the episode were composed by Durward Vanderhoop. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team: Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Finally, any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this episode do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.